Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lisa Millette, and I am a member of the SAKI TTA team, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I'm going to review a few housekeeping items for you. If technical support is needed, please let us know through the chat window or by emailing sakitta@rti.org. If you have any questions regarding today's material, please type them into the chat window or use the Q&A feature, and we will retain them for the Q&A session, which will be held at the end of the presentation. We will archive this webinar within a few business days, and we will also send out an email announcement to all who have registered. This announcement will also include a PDF copy of today's presentation as well as 2 handouts. You can view all of our archived webinars on the SAKI TTA website under the webinar section. This is the webinar Virtual Victim Support Engagement and Notification Panel Discussion. Next slide, please. Points of views or opinions in this document are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Our facilitator today is Amy Dural, and she is currently a project manager for the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and her portfolio includes work on the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, enhancing law enforcement response to victims, law enforcement-based victim services, documenting and advancing promising practices in law enforcement victim support, and research and evaluation of victims of crime. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Amy.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I think if they tried, they could come up with about 10 more words to add to every federal project that I'm working on. But suffice it to say that I have a history. My professional work history has always been around collaborative, multidisciplinary work in responding to those impacted by crime and crisis. And so that comes in a lot of forms, and I think that we all bring unique skill sets to the table. And part of why I'm so excited to be facilitating this conversation today is you're going to be hearing from our panel members who are going to be carrying the bulk of the conversation. And so I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. And so we'll just go in order of how you see them on the screen. And so we have 2 sites participating today. The first site is going to be the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. And first up is Mary. So Mary, do you want to briefly tell us who you are and a little bit about your site?
Can y'all hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, so my name is Mary Glass. I've been an assistant district attorney for over 20 years, primarily working with homicide and sexual assault cases. Currently involved with the SAKI unit here. Our team includes 7 members, including myself, co-counsel, an investigator, victim witness coordinators. And I don't even know how to describe how many cases and how many DNA hits we handle, but happy to say we're up and running and almost back to normal.
Fantastic. And I'm really excited to hear you all's contributions to the conversation today. I think it will be really relevant for the rest of the attendees and the sites participating. So next up we have Naomi. So Naomi, you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, all. My name is Naomi Jones. I am the trial prosecutor in the Orleans Parish DA's office, SAKI unit. I work with Mary Glass and Dave Vanelli and the rest of our unit on SAKI cases. My background is in the DA's office for about a decade now. I've done everything from domestic violence to appeals. Prior to that, I was briefly a teacher, and I am excited to see you all today.
Fantastic. Well, welcome, Naomi. And the last participant from Orleans is David. David, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is David Benelli. I'm the SAKI investigator. I've been with the District Attorney's Office for 10 years now. Prior to that, I spent 34 years with New Orleans Police Department. With the last 9 years, I was the commander of the Orleans Parish Sex Crimes Unit. I mean, the NOPD sex crime unit, but I've been working a special victim unit cases now here at the DA's office for the past 10 years.
Awesome. Well, welcome. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on all the conversation that we're going to have today. The other site that's participating today is the City of Akron, and so let's get a brief introduction of those panel members. So Sandra, you're up. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Sandra Ridgway Williams, and I am a detective in our SAKI unit here for the Akron Police Department. I've been with Akron for 30 years, but I am the last person to join into our SAKI unit. I've been here for just under a year. My background is in crime scene investigation, persons and property investigations. So I'm happy to be in the SAKI unit. I enjoy what I do. And we also, there's 3 of us that work in the unit, 3 investigators. And we also work hand in hand with our victim assistance and rape crisis center here in Akron for our investigations.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Sandra. Jasmine, you want to tell us who you are and how you're connected to the project?
Hello, everyone. I am Jasmine Jones. I am the Victim Advocate Coordinator for the Akron site. So I help coordinate the cases amongst the 2 community-based victim services agencies for our site. I have been at Victim Assistance Program for about 1.5 years, but I have been in the victim advocacy field for about 5 years. And I'm also a nationally credentialed advocate.
Awesome. Welcome, Jasmine. And last but not least, Patrick, you want to tell everybody who you are and your role?
Sure. I'm Detective Patrick Armstead. I'm a 26-year veteran of the Akron Police Department. I started my career in patrol and spent my 17 years there in patrol. My last 8 years I spent as a canine handler. I handled 2 dogs for the department before coming upstairs to the SAKI unit. I've been here since the onset, so all 3 years of our grant, I've been investigating cases.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Patrick. I can't wait to kind of dive into the conversation. Before we do that, I just want to kind of, just have a few minutes to really ground people into the framework of what we're going to be talking about today. And when we talk about victim support, engagement, and notifications, I think it's really important to recognize that, something that we stress all the time on this project is that we have collective responsibilities. Right? We need to function really well as team members from different disciplines, but all around shared responsibilities in how we respond to the people that are impacted by the crimes and the incidents that we're involved in. And so some of our collective responsibilities include ensuring ethical and equitable responses to those we serve. This is something that I made sure to stress to my staff for many years when I was in field practice as a director of victim services. But I think that's also something that when you have really cohesive teams, that everybody has that fresh on their mind, to make sure that anytime we respond to people that are impacted, that we do it in an ethical and equitable way. The other thing that we share responsibilities around is addressing fears, concerns, and barriers that people may have to engaging with the system. And we know that that exists. We hear anecdotally people talk about that all the time. But I think as a team, we can do a much better job when we think about addressing those fears, concerns, and barriers, both on those individual cases that we work on, but also as a system as a whole. So when we think about, the overarching practices and the overarching processes that we all share, and thinking through how we can really come together as a team to address those fears, to address the concerns that somebody may have, or to kind of reduce the barriers that will prevent people from engaging in an effective way. The other thing that's going to frame our conversation today is we're going to be talking about the critical needs of victims, to pose some of the questions. And I've been very fortunate to work with IACP, and we've had a long-standing relationship around enhancing law enforcement's response to victims. And out of that conversation that we've been having for over 20 years, we've recognized that there are pretty much 7 critical needs that victims have, and you guys are going to be getting a handout related to this, and you're going to see a link for that pop up in the chat. I encourage you to pull that down and kind of reflect on that and really think through what the needs of victims are as you go through your work. But what we're really talking about is victims have needs that revolve around safety. That's not just physical safety, but emotional and psychological safety as well. And it's up to us to create an environment that addresses all of those. Victims need support. They need support from us as professionals, but making sure we're being mindful of connecting people to victim service professionals and other support persons of their own choosing for the support that they need as they go through the process. Victims need information, and they need information about what their legal rights are, what resources are available, and future points of contact, and just simple explanations of the system itself. They need access, and this is, where we have to be self-reflective and think through, are we really giving people the opportunity to access our services, to access the processes that we're responsible for? And so that might look like physical access, through building access, technology access, language access, and making sure that what we offer is really and genuinely available to people. Victims also need continuity, and this is where it relies on us as professionals to make sure we're collaborating both within our own departments, but also with our partner agencies, right? Making sure that we're speaking to each other, sharing information, sharing data, so that as victims travel through the complex system, they can do that with a little more continuity and a little more consistency. And then victims also have a need for voice. We need to encourage people to ask questions and genuinely respond to them when those questions are raised. We need to respond to their concerns, and we need to be inclusive in our processes to make sure that those people that are impacted understand what we do. And then certainly they have a need for justice. And what I will tell you is that I've learned in my time over working in the system is that it's not really the traditional definition of justice that sometimes speaks to victims. And so victims have a strong need for us to be present, to be fair, to be ethical in the way we approach them. And sometimes that can look like procedural justice. And so that's something that I certainly encourage you to pull down the handout, take a look at that, and kind of think through that as you're going through your work. The next area that we're going to focus on today is the rights that victims have. And I know that most of us are pretty familiar with, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney. Most of us are less familiar with what's in the legal statutes for what victims' rights are. And so we have a handout that's attached. There's going to be a link in the chat pod. I encourage you to pull it down. We're also, in addition to Sexual Assault Awareness Month, right in the midst of Crime Victim Rights Week. And I think there's just been some amazing work that's happened over the years. And part of that draws right straight to the work that we're doing around sexual violence. And so I really kind of encourage you to pull that handout out and read through some of the work that the people came before us have done to make sure that the rights of victims are present and center when we're doing this work. And when we take a look at the critical needs of victims and when we address the legal rights that they have, those two things can lead us to responses that are collaborative and coordinated, which is what we talk about on this project all the time, right? Making sure that we've got good team communication and good team composition. But we also want to make sure that what we do is culturally responsive, that we take advantage of those multiple disciplines that have unique skill sets and can contribute to the shared work that we have, making sure that we're trauma informed, really understanding how trauma impacts people, and then taking all that knowledge and putting victims at the center of the decisions that we're making. and really taking into account their thoughts and their, their concerns when we go about the work. And so when we jump into the conversation today, what you're going to be seeing is we're going to be talking about the needs of victims and how were they impacted, the rights of victims and how did that look, and those responses that we all provide and what we've learned around that in the virtual world that we're all working in. And so we're going to jump into the section called Lessons Learned, right? And I think when I reflect back on a year ago, when this all started, I think that it caught us all a little off guard, right? None of us were really prepared for what our work was going to look like. And so what I'd like to do is just talk through what some of the sites have experienced in terms of lessons learned. And so one of the first prompts that we have is what are the most prominent victim needs that were identified during the incorporation of virtual communication? So all of those needs that I talked about in terms of what victims, need to get out of the system, I'd love to hear from the panelists about what were the most prominent victim needs during the incorporation of virtual communication. And I think to kick this off, we're going to kick it to the Orleans team. And so, Mary, would you be willing to kind of share with us what you guys have learned about meeting victim needs or the lessons learned during the incorporation of virtual?
Sure. I mean, it's always a challenge to keep in touch with our victims, our survivors, but they are foremost in our thoughts with everything that we do. And obviously the idea of communication sounds very simple, but it's not simple during a pandemic. We have some victims who didn't have access to internet or didn't have telephones, or we didn't know quite simply where they were if they were sick. We had some of our team members go down and get sick, and it's obviously hard to keep in touch with your victims and your survivors if you don't have your whole team and you don't have technology available to you. I don't know about anybody here, but I didn't Zoom prior to this. So we had a big learning curve, and I had my dog screaming in the back of a lot of meetings, as did a lot of people. So I would say the biggest need was keeping in touch with our VICs, letting them know what's going on with their cases, letting them know if their cases were moving. We had a lot of people, like I said, that were sick, unavailable, and we just didn't know how to reach them or how to keep in touch with them. I would say that was the biggest need.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mary. And I think that ties right back to what I was talking about, how victims have a need for information from us. And if we don't have the mechanisms in place to deliver that, it really does impact them. It impacts all of our partners as well. So Jasmine, do you have anything to add to this in terms of what you saw in Akron around the most prominent victim needs?
Yes, so I can definitely relate to what Mary is referring to and the need to communicate. Also, I will point out for our site is the understanding of what's happening in court, right? So just to give you all a little insight, everything with our courts was kind of at a standstill. But there were some trials that were still happening, but most of them were at a standstill. We had an order that no trials were going to happen in our county. And so the survivors needed to know what's happening with court in a way that they can understand it, right? Because, we can throw all of this information at them all day, but we need to put it in terms that they can understand on top of dealing with the pandemic and daily life stressors. So our site found that needing to know the information and what's happening in courts and with their cases is was one of the most pertinent needs that we found.
So can you talk me through just a little bit about, when cases go to court, but did they also have a need for that prior to cases going to court? And what did that information and that communication channel look like for those cases as well?
Well, one of the things that you'll hear some of my team members talk about is how we had to adjust being able to approach new cases, but for the cases that were already awaiting trial and hearing that, we're sorry your trial can't move forward, we're sorry it can't move forward, it just wasn't enough. We had to find ways to be creative as a team and implement ways so that survivors could feel heard and really understand what exactly was going on with the court system.
Right, right. I appreciate that. Let's shift to talking about the legal rights that people have, right? So what I'd like to kind of pursue is just how did the shift to virtual communication maybe put a barrier in or impede the ability of victims to exercise those rights? What did that look like now that we shifted to this world, and how did that maybe put something in the way of victims being able to exercise those rights that they have in each of your jurisdictions? So Naomi, do you want to talk us through what that looked like in Orleans?
So victims in Louisiana have a series of rights, some constitutional and some codified in statute. And there were several of their rights that this pandemic situation had a profound impact on. I would say the foremost would be, as the other speakers were talking about, would be the right to a reasonably prompt resolution. Well, there's been nothing reasonably prompt about the year that set the world back, okay? And that has definitely been a barrier to their rights. They also have the right to be present and informed in court. That has been problematic in the few situations where once we started moving into Zoom court, the difference between Zoom court and real life court, one of the major differences is that the judges on Zoom court wanted to know who everybody was, and you had to turn on your camera to make sure you weren't being recorded. So if we had a sexual assault survivor who wanted to come to court, sit in the back of the room, be quiet, watch what happened, and basically, act on her rights, she no longer could do that. She was going to be identified. She was going to have her face on the internet. So that definitely impeded their rights. They also had the right to be informed of when the next date was. And sometimes we didn't know the answer to that question. There was a lot of chaos. There were rulings made on days when courts weren't open. And a lot of confusion. And I think everybody experienced that across the country, but our victims have a right to essentially not suffer that, but they did. Additionally, they have the right to refuse to be interviewed by defense attorneys. And despite us filing things prior to the pandemic seemed to give some of our defense attorneys a little bit more free time. And so they were able to track down some of our survivors and attempt to interview them, even though they had already vocalized that they did not want to be interviewed. So I would say with those four rights were definitely impacted by this situation.
Well, and I really appreciate you articulating that, because I think sometimes, we have a hard time kind of, really drilling down and clearly defining what rights look like as we carry out our responsibilities. And, the fear and just kind of the overwhelming sense of exposure that victims have sometimes could be amplified through this environment, right? And so I think that's an important thing to bring out. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, and that maybe some of the sites still haven't thought all the way through around if victims want to participate but don't necessarily want to be identified or don't necessarily want to be exposed in that way, what obligation or what steps are we taking to put those protections in place to make sure their rights are still being exercised, but in a responsible and thoughtful way? Patrick, I'm just curious from the law enforcement perspective, what were you seeing around this issue in Akron?
I'll start by saying our first issue is more along the lines of how it affected our protocol. Our victim notification protocol was set to be a face-to-face protocol where we would go out with the victim advocates and make an in-person attempt to notify. Before COVID, we did this pretty regularly, and we actually had good success in contacting victims, engaging them in the conversation. Now, whether they, chose to opt out or pursue prosecution, that was up to them ultimately. However, when you throw COVID in and you have just a phone call or just a um, Zoom meeting or whatever, they don't really get the same, that in-person contact. I always tell Jasmine and the other advocates, when we don't get a response, it's so much easier to, you know, shut the door on you when you're just a voice on the phone. But when you're standing on someone's front porch, it's a lot easier to get yourself in and make that initial contact. So I think that's where our survivors suffered a little bit as it relates to our protocol. And then the next thing is probably really, as Jasmine and Naomi mentioned before, is a lot of it really stems around the court process. In one particular instance, like Jasmine said, our court's literally shut down. So we've only had one SAKI trial really go through to completion. In that case, the man was in jail already for another crime. So, once it all ultimately came down to a plea deal, and obviously the victim wanted her voice heard during a victim impact statement because of all the restrictions we had here, they were so stringent that she couldn't even appear to face him to make her impact statement. So, to her, she never really got the full closure, she really wanted. I mean, she got to make her statement, but obviously she's making it through a camera to someone that she can't see. She's just making it to the court. So,
Right. Yeah, and I have to imagine that that changed, her perspective of the system, but also, just thinking through what the system looks like from the lens of a victim, and really making sure that in addition to carrying out, our daily responsibilities, we do have to pay attention to the rights that victims have and how we're helping them exercise them and attend to those rights. And that's just as high on our radar, I would hope during the pandemic. But as we talk through those needs that victims have and the rights that were impacted, I think the next logical thing is, how did those things impact our response? And so as you think through the pandemic and what that looked like in each of your jurisdictions, I would love to hear just what modifications to practices occurred, maybe both inside your organizations, but also maybe practice modifications of partner organizations. And then what about those modifications brought up the challenges that you all chose to address? So David, do you want to talk us through a little bit about what that looked like for Orleans?
Yes, ma'am. I tell you what, when this pandemic hit, it hit us quick. And what happened is basically our office shut down. We had 32 investigators one day. The next day we had 6. They laid off 26 investigators. They came up with a directive from the city that only like 8 people were allowed in this building at any time, and only 4 people were allowed on any floor at any time. So our access to the building, our access to government agencies, because basically the city shut down, just diminished. One thing that helped us, the SAKI team, extremely well, is the fact that the SAKI team remained the SAKI team. We worked throughout the pandemic, either here at the office or at home. We all had laptops where we can continue providing the service. And one thing we learned, I think the number one lesson that we learned, is that we were able to maintain the same professional service that we give our victims, survivors, as we did prior to. It was a little bit more difficult, but not one of our victims lacked the ability to have our services. It took a lot of initiative on Mary's part and Naomi's part to deal with the courts that it almost seemed like they did not want to open. And so they had to deal with the system, communications, maintaining constant communications with our victims and our witnesses. And you got to remember, we're dealing with very old cases. So most of our police officers and detectives and crime lab technicians that we're dealing with are either retired or dead. So we're dealing with, keeping constant communication through all the difficulties that we had in the city, as difficult as it appeared to be, we were able to do it. And that's the one thing I'm very, very proud of our unit for doing it, is that we didn't let a little pandemic get in the way of doing our job.
I would say that this is more than a little pandemic, but I appreciate the sentiment, David. But I do think that you bring up a good point, right? That the work that you all put into forming those collaborative relationships before this happened is probably your saving grace for how you got through the pandemic, right? So really understanding and having that open line of communications, not only internally, but with your partners, when you have to make a change to your practices, when you have to change something about the way you approach something or the way that you communicate, can be incredibly helpful when the need arises. And so I think it's important for all the sites to kind of recognize that. So Sandra, do you want to talk us through maybe what this looked like in Akron and maybe some of the, some of the changes that occurred at either your agency or with partner agencies that really impacted people?
Yes, I have to agree with David. For us, the investigators, we had to, luckily, we were able to go home with laptops, and our laptops had all the different apps that we needed to still conduct our investigations. We would still have to go into the station to pick up our hard case files, but that wasn't so bad. Our city as a whole, we were hit pretty hard. The city of Akron offices, our police station was just a petri dish for COVID. As for communicating with our survivors, it kind of was hindered because we weren't able to speak to them from our office phones. We were giving them our work cell phone numbers in order to contact us. And so, but as for reaching out to them, it really didn't change. We still were able to do face-to-face. A lot of times we were talking out on porches and not going inside of people's houses because they didn't feel comfortable, of course, wearing our mask. But, although it's been a challenge, we've still been able to conduct interviews. Now, when we have out-of-state survivors, that's really been a challenge for us because we haven't been able to travel very much. We've had several survivors who are in prison, and we're not able to go and see them and talk to them face to face. So it's been kind of a challenge trying to coordinate, speaking with, going through all the different departments to try to speak to a prisoner. So it's had its challenges, but we've been able to kind of work through it.
And I appreciate that. And that's something that I think we don't often think about, right? Is the obligation to speak to those who are incarcerated and the different practices that were instituted around the country, regional differences in terms of, the local rules and restrictions and recommendations that were put in place and how that impacted each of our work, right? And in terms of communicating with not only the victims that are impacted, but also investigative leads and suspects that are identified, and really making sure that we keep carrying through our work, as this came up. So I appreciate you all talking about all of those challenges. And I think what I'd like to transition to is maybe, and you've all touched on it a little bit, is that just the what's working part, right? The part of this that we've learned that maybe surprised us a little bit, or maybe taught us that we're a little more resilient and flexible than we thought we were when this started. And so really thinking through that from a needs of victims perspective, really, how have you and your partners kind of leveraged technology and systems to successfully meet victims' needs? Like, how is that, what have you done to take that and frame it in a positive way? And how has that really benefited your work? So let's kick this to Mary. Mary, I'd love to hear, we've heard about all the challenges, but maybe what have you learned in the past year around how you can better meet the needs of victims, or use what you're facing to kind of meet those needs?
Well, when I was taking my notes, and I have a little notepad here in case I, blanked out on you guys, but I wrote down grant, 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 because SAKI really came through for us and got my entire team laptop computers, scanners, printers, new phones. I mean, when I say we were able to keep in touch, we were able to keep in touch. And yes, sometimes we were in our pajamas, whatever it was. But, and I'll give you a good example. We have a case where one of our survivors was actually sexually assaulted during the April of the pandemic, the original April, right after the world fell apart. And that case, I'm happy to say, was indicted within a few months of that time. Even with all of the challenges we faced, she was immediately put in touch with victim witness advocates at the Family Justice Center, who kept in touch with us, either by phone or by computer, whatever was working at the time, because she had to flee the state because he assaulted her sexually in her own home, and she was afraid. We were able to keep in touch with her, with the Family Justice Center, with NOPD, and eventually with the courts to take that case from a sexual assault to an investigation, to a DNA hit, and to indictment in 6 months' time. About, and we are still in touch with her. We are still in touch with her with the Family Justice Center. And to say that that case went from stem to stern and now is in the discovery process, the courts are opening back up. But without the technology, without the virtual, I mean, SAKI was very specific. They were like, what do you need to telework? And I love that word because I've never really heard it before, but telework. I'm like, okay, we need phones, we need computers, we need, and whatever we had, we needed. This room right here that you see was provided by SAKI, updating our conference room so that we had Zoom technology like this office has never had before. We were actually able to indict a second case that had occurred back in 1975. 1975, and that victim wanted to be here so badly for the indictment that she flew herself in. She flew herself in the middle of a pandemic, and we were actually able to go rather covertly from here into the courtroom so that she could hear the indictment being read out loud in court. Now, she didn't get to see him. She didn't get to go into the grand jury room, but our grand jury process really didn't stop for long. Arrests obviously kept happening. That case didn't even involve an arrest. That case involved a victim reaching out to us and saying, hey, whatever happened to my kit? We didn't find the kit, but we located secondary evidence, and we just kind of kept going. We were able to indict 2 cases during the pandemic, both very violent. Naomi and I actually wrote the grant that is going on right now and closed out the other grant. So we couldn't have done any of those things without technology. We learned very quickly how to use what we had and how to ask SAKI what we needed, and SAKI was there.
Well, I really, really appreciate that, Mary, because I think sometimes what, as professionals who kind of work in this arena and we hear the stories of people day in, day out of, maybe how they were, not attended to the first time, or their cases have been forgotten or pieces missed. But to hear that you guys are able to pull that together and find a way throughout this to really find supportive resources to make this actually, from my perspective, go through what seems like a speeded up process from what we typically tell victims, right? We prepare victims for very lengthy processes and engagement with the system. And that's encouraging to me for you guys to express that you found a way to use that technology to your advantage to make sure that those steps continued, but also made sure that they continued in a timely way. And I think the victims probably feel that as well. Patrick, how about in Akron? Did you guys see where the virtual technology and communication enhanced and helped you meet the needs of victims?
Most definitely. Obviously, I want to say thank goodness for Zoom and Teams and WebEx and FaceTime. Without those, especially early on in the pandemic, in Ohio, it was pretty much a no contact rule the first couple months. So depending on either one of the four agencies, at one point we were all at home. Uh, the RCC, the Summit County, Medina County Rape Crisis Center, they had a longer period they were out. So we leveraged this amongst ourselves, but essentially and more effectively, we leveraged them to benefit our survivors. So where we couldn't go to meet them, whether it was for that initial contact or to do an interview, we did everything we can to, as Jasmine likes to say, meet them where they are. So wherever we could do it, we did it. So, in one instance, I actually did a initial notification and a cursory interview basically by text message. Now, this survivor was obviously adverse to police contact. She was adamant she wouldn't give me her address, and when I did find the address, she didn't open the door. But she started texting me the next day. So she's not going to give me her phone number. She's not going to, divulge any other information. But she's engaging. So strangely enough, and it's not optimal, obviously, but I engaged with her through text because that's what she chose. I mean, she chose that means to, resolve the case. And ultimately, she didn't choose to participate, but the option was there for her, and I did get to engage her. Where if we had strictly used our protocol, I probably never would have gotten to engage her. Um, Obviously, the virtual meeting platforms, I'm sure for everybody have been tremendous, especially when when you're talking about geographic distance. When I started, I think I counted between survivors and potential defendants, I had covered over 16 of the 50 states um, with people I had to meet and or talk to. So obviously, with one victim, one survivor I have, obviously she's in Seattle, and that's the only means. I could never go and fly to Seattle 3 times on SAKI money to update her on the case or tell her when the next court date is. That just wasn't going to happen, obviously. So um, also, when we did some interviews and especially like case reviews post indictment, um, we've used the virtual platforms to get together our entire multidisciplinary team at once with the survivors, so they're not getting bombarded from each separate agency. I mean, in our collective, we have 5 entities that exist. So, for the survivor to get 5 separate calls to say, okay, new trial day, and then I call new trial day, and then Jasmine calls. We did a very good job, I think, using those platforms to minimize the amount of information they had to receive from multiple contacts. Um, so that is really the best. In one case particular, we did get a chance. It was a serial case to get all 4 survivors together, knowing that after this gentleman was indicted, this was going to be a long haul. And I think getting the 4 of them together, letting them know that they weren't in this by themselves, we've had tremendous success with continued engagement. As a matter of fact, his trial date is now set, and I've already heard it just got set yesterday, and I've already heard back from 2 of the victims today. So I think by them getting to group together, and they actually have formed their own collective, they all feel like they're working together for each other. So.
I can't express enough how important I think what you just said was to the overarching conversation, right? And making sure that it's on us as professionals to adjust, to make sure that we continue to try and engage people in the system, not by our own thoughts and processes of what that looks like, but by how they choose to engage. So let's flip into legal rights. So we've heard how this kind of, the virtual platforms kept us moving, but how has expanded access through virtual platforms enhanced the ability for victims to exercise their legal rights? We heard a little while ago about how it impeded that, but are there ways that it also enhanced that? So Naomi, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So New Orleans, we're in an interesting position because most of our survivors are out of the jurisdiction. By nature of New Orleans and all that is glorious and wonderful about it, a lot of people come here and they don't always stay. And so we were kind of familiar with that dynamic. Of the folks that we do have in Orleans who are survivors, many of them struggle with all of the challenges of poverty. So one of the things we did is we put a phone in their hand. They come here, we have phones, we have phone cards, courtesy of SAKI. Thank you, SAKI. So they can Zoom with us, so they can text with us, so they can call us. With the folks who are out of state, should they need a phone, that would have been available to them as well. But thus far, we haven't crossed that bridge. What we found works with them is the Zoom meetings have actually been an improvement upon what I used to do, which was just a telephone call. I also, I learned how to three-way the phone call, not the other thing. And that has been very, very, very helpful as well. We've had meetings with multiple partners, not just me telling the survivor what happened in court, but her advocate is also on the Zoom meeting. And in some cases, her attorney is on the Zoom meeting. And that's been really helpful because she's getting the benefit of something that never would have happened pre-pandemic. We just are not going to schedule a meeting with 5 people and somehow manage to make it happen in the chaos of the jobs that we all do. We also set up sort of a concert ticket system is what I like to, where you know how you stand in line for concert tickets, or you sit there by the phone and you keep hitting redial, 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 redial to see when the next date is. We would set pretrial conferences for the day after when the jury summons would have had to go out for the next month. So we were able to see if we could set a trial that next following month. Now I'm hearing probably July, maybe June, we'll see, but we keep setting these sort of, I keep calling Ticketmaster and waiting for them to answer the phone is basically how we use our court dates. Also, another thing that we have been able to do is we talked about people sort of going out and reaching out to survivors from the defense team, and the survivors did not want them present. We ran into a real challenge with that, but we were able to work with some of our partner organizations, STAR, which is a crisis advocacy group, and the Family Justice Center, to check this out, get survivors their own attorneys, okay? Because as much as I want to say I'm here for the survivor, I represent the state of Louisiana, and we all have situations where sometimes those two are in conflict, right? And sometimes, often, what the defense's rights are and the victim's rights are totally in conflict as well. Is that there are organizations out there who will offer legal representation to survivors. And what scares people more than me saying, hey, she doesn't want to talk to you, is when another attorney sends them a letter and says, I represent so-and-so in this matter. Attorneys are not allowed to talk to other people's clients without that attorney's permission. And that really, really helped that. And it also gave the survivor a vehicle if she did want to talk to the defense attorney to do that, and to do that where her desires were protected. You know, as prosecutors, we have agendas, but sometimes our survivors have different desires than what we do. And by getting them their own attorney, that allowed them to stand up for that. Also, the attorneys could go on Zoom, and when the judge asked, who are you? They said, I'm the attorney for the survivor. So the survivor didn't have to expose herself on the internet like that. So.
What a fantastic representation of really thinking creatively. And I think that's something, as a victim services director, I ran into that for years when I would advocate for victims to have their own attorneys. There was resistance from the system. But what I really tried to stress to them is that this person is also there for your protection and can get you access to the system in a way that I can't, right? And so I think that's a really creative way to think through how to use technology and how to use the situation that you're facing to really make sure and enhance the rights of those victims. Sandra, what about in Akron? Did you find that you were able to enhance victims' rights in a way using virtual platforms and technology?
Yes, I believe so, because several of our survivors have also relocated to other cities in Ohio as well as other states over the years since their initial assault. And but thanks to having these virtual platforms as well as other digital platforms, we've been able to make contact with the survivors. A lot of times if someone is out of state, I have a young lady out of state in Oregon, and I was able to contact that law enforcement agency there in her city, and they were able to stand in the gap for me to make that initial contact with her, because we like to have that face-to-face contact with them. So not only did this officer went and made contact with her, he passed on my information, and then she contacted me, and then we started talking on the phone. I conducted my interview via phone. Then eventually that moved into doing some FaceTime talking with her. I was able to still deal with that same officer there in Oregon, and he was able to take my photo array and go and administer that for her and get all that back to me. So thankfully, we have those platforms available so that we can still maintain contact. As far as like our survivors who have been incarcerated, we've been able to do the video conferencing. So that was also good. And it was also good too, the one woman that I had to deal with who's incarcerated, she was able to have her counselor there with her to help her through this bomb we were dropping into her life, bringing up this sexual assault that had occurred to her years ago. So.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I think that's a really great reminder for all of us who are working and kind of contributing efforts in this arena, that people's lives may look very different from when the incident originally happened, and we have to be prepared and use all of our resources to respond to them in the best way that we can in their present life, and really taking into account what that looks like now. So as we think through this, and I think you guys have really touched on some really, innovative practices, but maybe talk a little bit about what other changes to the way you do business has resulted in enhanced responses from your agency or from the team in general. So David, do you want to talk us through maybe what that looks like in New Orleans, in terms of just the enhanced response and how you guys have made the adjustments?
Well, one of the things that we were able to do is because of the ability to communicate is really to develop a cooperation between other jurisdictions and other elements of the criminal justice system in the state of Louisiana. I give you an example. We had a victim survivor of a horrific sexual assault who several months later actually died. We had a meeting with the two daughters where we were able to bring them here and actually have an in-face meeting to talk about the case in which the accused was about to plead guilty, and discuss their ability to do an impact statement, which really would help their closure for the two daughters. The main concern was that they had a brother, and their brother was currently incarcerated in Louisiana in a facility over 200 miles away. Now, their brother knew that his mother has passed away, but did not know that she was a victim of an assault. But we wanted to give him, and they wanted to give him, an opportunity to express himself so that he could have a victim impact statement. So we were able to communicate with this facility, which is 200 miles away. I spoke to the the assistant warden and a major over there. And what we're able to do is they were able to set up a Zoom meeting with us where we're able to bring the two sisters here in this room that we're speaking in right now, where the two sisters were able to communicate with their brother for the first time in over 5 years. And they were able to talk about the passing of their mother. And Mary and Naomi was speaking to this young man as far as what would he like us to say representing him at this victim impact statement. And it gave him, even though he's incarcerated, gave him an opportunity to have some type of closure over his mother's death, victimization. The two sisters were able to assist in that way also. And while the sisters were here with our victim witness associate, we found out these two ladies were trying to get a job. They were looking for housing. And the whole time they were here with this, we're able to get online and secure the ability for one to find a job and for them to find some permanent housing. So it just shows how if you put effort into it and have faith in other elements of the criminal justice system, things like this can work out. Because I never thought I'd ever have a day where I could have a Zoom meeting with a person who's incarcerated with his own family as we're discussing his mother's victimization. So it was a very unique experience for me. But now that we know we can do it, this won't be the last time.
And I really appreciate that, David. And I can only, with confidence say that probably left a lasting impression on that family as well. Kind of changed their perspective of the system, but also of you as professionals. So I appreciate you sharing that. Jasmine, is there anything that you want to add about, how modifications might have enhanced the responses in Akron? What does that look like, and what can you tell us?
So I will say that our process and our protocol was definitely enhanced as a result of this. So we all know that it's difficult to find individuals when working on cold cases. So I think it put some extra pressure on our investigators to try to nail down that address, the most recent and correct address as they could the first time. So this helped us prevent from going out multiple times and making contact with multiple people during a pandemic. In addition to that, one of the most challenging things for advocates was being able to make contact via phone while we're working remotely. So the investigators have the luxury of using their work cell phones, whereas the advocates and community-based advocacy agencies operate off their 24-hour hotline. So a lot of the calls that we are conducting with survivors are unknown or private numbers, and no one answers those numbers, So we found our advocates needing to come together with Victim Assistance Program and the Rape Crisis Center of, how can we meet the needs of these survivors? So we relied a lot on converting to using electronic documents for our releases of information. That helped us, using DocuSign, for example. It could easily be sent to a client to complete, fill out, and easily come back to us, as long as the survivor had access to that technology. We found the same thing with our intake forms. We needed to convert a lot of our documents to the fillable option so that survivors could get those completed. We also relied a lot on our investigators and their capabilities to text and call from an unblocked number. So that definitely helped. And I think that's a platform and an option that we will definitely sustain. Some people just prefer to text, not everyone wants to talk over the phone. And so that has definitely been helpful to say, hey, Stan, hey, Patrick, I haven't gotten in touch with so-and-so. Can you just reach out to them? And so that's definitely helped. We've also identified within our protocol So Patrick talked about this earlier. We had, when our unit first started, we wanted to identify specific steps and responsibilities amongst each disciplinary. Well, obviously with the pandemic, things change. So we have to figure out how we're going to do this. So we identified certain things within our protocol that would help us respond to this. So with the challenges of locating survivors, one of the things that I found working remotely is that I would usually email some of the advocates the case assignments, but everyone has different schedules working remotely. Some people had to be flexible to meet their agency needs. And so instead of emailing, we will call. So, hey, we finally got a hold of this person who we've been looking for. This is the time and date I need you to be here to meet with this individual or speak with this individual over the phone. We definitely did a lot of conference calls with survivors, really trying to be creative and building that rapport with that survivor over the phone. Someone mentioned earlier, you know, it's different when you can see face to face and you can, you know who I am and you can see that I'm a safe person and you trust me, but it's an additional challenge to try to do that over the phone. So really trying to pour into that and build that trust and rapport. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty much everything that we had to modify, and it definitely helped our response.
Well, I appreciate that, Catherine. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was really, you know, as you're working through this, really thinking through what are those things we're going to keep around. And I think, you know, both of the sites have talked about this today. So I think what I'd like to do is just have you talk about, you know, one of those practices that you modified that you plan to keep in place now, you know, as the pandemic subsides and as things are getting lifted and restrictions are getting lifted. So Mary, do you want to talk to us about something that you guys put in place that you're planning to keep around?
I think we'll be Zooming for quite some time. You know, our survivors run the gamut of, please don't talk to me unless there's something coming up in court, versus please talk to me every single week because I want an update or I want someone to just comfort me. And we have one case in particular where the young lady is quite intelligent. She studies in the criminal justice arena. She's doing graduate work. And more often than not, Naomi and I end up learning something from her, maybe something that we should think about or something we should address in our case. But she really needs us to keep in touch with her on an almost weekly, if not bi-weekly basis. And Zoom has made that incredibly simple. Like Naomi said, we can have her attorney there, we can have our advocate there, we can bring in Dave if we need to for safety issues. But I think Zooming and keeping in touch with defense attorneys, detectives, survivors, expert witnesses is going to be taking place virtually for a long time. It's just more efficient. There's no parking, there's no extra planning, there's no travel time, there's no traffic. So as simple as that answer sounds, I think that is logistically the most reasonable thing that we're going to definitely keep in place.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more, Mary. I think now that the capability is there, why would you not take advantage of it when we know that it's just proven to be effective and useful? Patrick, do you have anything to add? Like what is something that you all have changed that you're going to keep in place?
I'd probably just echo what Mary said. I mean, I think that Zoom has been a godsend. Like if we didn't have it, where would we be? You know, we have, I think, close to 30 people in our full SAKI team. You know, we'd be able to hold that meeting, as well as, like I mentioned before, the victim notification part. Especially when there's multiple survivors, you know, how do you manage that? And you look at it from the COVID standpoint. Well, you know, nobody can be together, so we would have to do it anyway. But in that particular instance, we got distance. So we have, you know, North Carolina, Virginia, Arizona, and Florida. So those are where my survivors are. So we'd have no other option, you know. So before, right. And as I found in looking through the older investigations, you know, where investigators lost contact with the survivor before, or maybe said they moved away, I can't interview them, and the case kind of stalled. Well, now, we can take that out of the mix. Well, there's no reason why, if you know where she is or have a phone number, hey, let's do a Zoom. So in those cases, we kind of thwart that whole, that short circuit that was happening before, where people would move away and all of a sudden there's no funds to travel and you can't go wherever. I mean, now, I can meet all four of them in 5 separate states and have all the people there and all the moving parts there at once. So like Mary said, there's Zoom is here to stay. So.
Right. I appreciate that. So let's just, and I think you both touched on it, right? But those practices that impact your workload, either internally or externally with collaborative partners, is there anything unique about practices that impact your workload that you plan on keeping around? Naomi, do you want to offer anything up?
Sure. I got a scanner during the pandemic for the first time, and you're going to have to pry it out of my cold, dead hands because I love the scanner. And I will continue using the scanner and fighting off anybody who tries to take it. Also, I really love doing our sort of required meetings via Zoom. As Mary said, that saves a whole lot of time and aggravation. I don't know if you all have like MDT meetings or SART meetings and those kinds of things. And we have charge conference where we meet with law enforcement before we accept a case. Right. Those meetings going Zoom has I think saved a lot of time and a lot of money. I am hoping when we start opening back up for real actual trials that I can convince the courts to let me Zoom in experts because they are expensive. And I would rather Zoom in 3 expensive experts than fly in 1.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's also something to continue the conversation about is how do we use this to be fiscally responsible in turn, as well as meeting the needs of our jobs. Jasmine, do you have anything else to add to that about workload or processes that might stay in place after this?
So I hate to keep saying the same thing, but the virtual platforms are the best. Even thinking about training components. So during this pandemic, we still have to keep on with business as usual. We have new staff coming on. How are we going to get our advocates trained while working remotely? I found as the coordinator, it extremely helpful to gather our team, even to be connected, on a monthly basis. Like we haven't seen each other, how's everyone doing? And to conduct the training needs that we had for advocates that were coming onto our team. So that'll definitely stay. Also, I found that my office is in the same space as the investigators. And when we all had to go and work remotely, it felt so much different. Like we all felt it. Any other time I could just drop in on them at any time, they could drop in on me. And we had that close relationship. And now it's like, I found myself having to intentionally, check in with them weekly because we're not seeing each other. So definitely keeping that office space closely connected with the investigators.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Jasmine. And I think we'll just kind of wrap up the conversation today with just that time-old stamped wisdom, right? If you knew then what you know now, what would you tell other agencies? What is that? Those kind of golden nuggets of wisdom that you would be willing to pass on? And David, I'm looking right at you, and so hit us with your best information about what you want to share with everybody.
Well, I learned about 15 years ago what it's like to deal with a bad situation, because when I was with the New Orleans Police Department, COVID hit, and it basically shut down the police department, shut down the facilities of the DA's office, shut down everything. We had like 4 feet of water, so I know how to deal with adverse situations. But we had less people die of Katrina than we did with COVID, so it's a totally different thing. But one thing that if I give advice to any organization, make sure you have excellent, good, current contact information on all the parties involved. Because in SAKI cases, there's a lot of some of these cases are 20, 30 years old. And so you have retired officers, retired detectives, retired SANE nurses, you have victims and witnesses that probably no longer live in your area. So you have to maintain that current, correct contact information so that when everything is lost, at least you have the ability to contact these people. And the one bit of advice I can tell people is just realize that your unit is capable of doing almost the impossible if you work together. Because I know this unit here, dealing with all the impasses that we had with COVID, we never missed a beat. We never lost a step. Not one victim was denied any access to us or access to us providing a service to them to help them get somewhat closer to closure. You know, so the thing is you got to be resilient. You just got to stick to it and just go out there and do your job, which we did. And I think that'll help you move forward in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And Sandra, do you have any last bit of wisdom to pass on to the folks that are listening before we jump into Q&A? You're on mute, Sandra.
I was on top of it until just now. Okay. So what I would like to say is, what I would like to advise everyone is, if you don't have a really working relationship with your local victim advocacy program, you need to start. I tell you, I never really had to work with any of the victim advocates before, and I love our victim advocates. I do. I love Jasmine. I love Sammy. They're just great, wonderful people. And as an investigator, we're going and making these face-to-face initial contacts with these survivors. When we get there, we have no idea what's going on in that survivor's world at that moment. And then here we come out of nowhere and drop this huge bomb into the middle of their life. And many of the survivors, I've come to find out, they've put all of that so far away, and here we come bringing it all out into the forefront. If it wasn't for having one of my victim advocates there with me, Jasmine, Sammy, I don't know which way that my investigation would go just from that initial contact. But victim advocates are great. I had one young lady go into total meltdown, and Sammy jumped in and was able to do some breathing exercises with her and brought her back in. And then I was able to do what I needed to do as an investigator and start talking to her. But my main thing is victim advocacy. They're great. If you have them and you don't have a relationship with them, get one.
Great. Thank you for that, Sandra. And I think that really drives home just the team approach that we promote, and that we know is effective, and that we know when everybody contributes their unique skill sets and their experiences and their talents, and the people that we serve benefit from that. And so I think that's a great reminder. We have time to kind of address Q&A. And so you can either type questions into the chat pod. There is a question and answer section. And so I think I just want to acknowledge, I so much appreciate the panelists. What I've heard about today is innovative ways to keep people engaged, and really applying your skills and staying focused so that you respond to the needs of victims, elevate the rights that they have. And I just want to personally commend you all, because I think what that does is it builds trust in the system. People are going to need the system again at some point in their life, not just about this case, but but for other things. And I think the work that we all do contributes to that. And so I just personally appreciate that and want to acknowledge that I've heard some really fantastic stuff today. And so as we kind of flip to giving people space, I am seeing one question. And so I'll throw this out to anybody on the panel who wants to answer it. Internet, cameras, phones, home internet access, et cetera, all often inaccessible to people, particularly marginalized populations or folks living in poverty. So how can you guys speak to how you've been able to overcome some of these gaps in service and access? So when somebody doesn't have access to Zoom, or when somebody doesn't have access to the internet itself, what have you all done to adjust your practices to give them accessibility to the services that you offer?
I guess Naomi from New Orleans, we asked SAKI for money to buy phones. And then when they gave us the phones, we put those phones in our victims' hands. And our survivors were able to stay in touch with us, and that made a world of difference. In other situations, like some victim impact testimony, we would have the survivors come here to our conference room, and they would be able to Zoom into the courthouse across the street. But yeah, I mean, poverty, it's not just about like access to the court case as well. It's also about, you know, people who relocate and they move all the time and they change their phone numbers and all of that. And you just have to be as supportive and understanding and respectful as possible when that happens, you know, and use your victim advocates to try to get folks access to the resources that can help them overcome some of those obstacles, you know, and follow up with them. Like our victim advocate just didn't give somebody a referral to a job resources center. She called up and asked how it went, and so that there's some follow up. So.
Some of that continuity that we talked about earlier, right? Just making sure that we carry through for victims, and we don't just, you know, toss them. We do a supportive handoff, and we make sure that they transition smoothly between all of us. And so thank you for that. And I do think that that's a great reminder that sometimes you have to use the resources that you already have, just use them in new ways. And so you guys really tapping into the SAKI resources and saying, hey, we're in a bind here, and what can you do to help us? You know, maybe other sites can also share that same kind of practice philosophy and really tap into what do we already have on our table that we can use in a new way. So another question that's come in, and I think this will be interesting for both sites to speak to. So is your agency's policy to notify all or notify on a case by case? And did this change during the past year? So how have each of you approached the notification? Let's start with Akron. So who wants to take care of it for Akron?
I'll take it, Amy, if you want.
Perfect.
Patrick from Akron. Yeah, so in our site, we had roughly 1,500 untested SACs that we sent through. Of those, somewhere around 550 came back with hits. So in our initial plan was to first handle the SACs that came back with profiles, and to attempt, at the very least, to make a physical contact with each of those survivors. So obviously a big task to create or to achieve in 3 years. I'm glad to say we're somewhere around 200 that we've cleared in the 3 years. Our first year of the grant, we actually didn't function as a unit yet. It wasn't until the second year where we were formed. So yeah, I mean, that's just our policy, and that's we try to make contact in some fashion with each one of those survivors.
Fantastic. And what does that look like in Orleans? Are you guys doing notify all, or do you have a triage system for how to do that?
You know, we're in a unique situation, and I would have to say kind of case by case, kind of triage. It's kind of a combination of things, because we were very unlucky with our original grant that our lab didn't actually do the work it was supposed to do. So we were kind of stuck with Do we call someone when we know something? Do we call someone when we found something? And we literally are going case by case and still going back through all of the original SAKI cases to figure out what to do. It is obviously our goal to reach out to everyone. And like I said earlier, we've had cases where the kits were either lost or didn't have enough genetic material. In those cases, we're trying to go back and look for secondary evidence. And at that time, we would notify someone. But in our old cases, our crime lab won't process anything without new samples from survivors. So in those instances, we have to reach out. But it is definitely case by case. It is definitely triage across the board. But our goal would be to notify everybody. Our goal would also be to get every kit tested. We're not there yet. We're still working toward that.
Right. And one thing I'll offer up, we talk to sites about this all the time, right? There is no one right answer for every site. One thing that I would encourage as somebody who has these conversations with sites often is really do some tabletop exercises and think through how you're going to handle things before you get ready to do the notification, right? So really think through what does that mean, and make sure your partners are in agreement with the approach, and talk through that as a team before you decide to do it, right? It's not just up to law enforcement to make a decision or up to prosecution to make a decision and tell everybody else how it's going to roll out. You really have to have those team conversations and talk through, if we're going to notify everyone, what does that look like? What are the numbers? Do we have the staff capacity for that? What is what is that going to result in? And making sure that you've got a stable communication plan and support network in place for all of those people that you've now reopened communication with. So reach out to your liaisons because they can put you in touch with people if you're having more specific questions about your notification protocols, and they can put you in touch with other sites or even subject matter experts to help you through that. So this is a unique question, and I'm going to throw it out there. It says perhaps it's beyond the scope, but I would love to hear your perspective and experience with notifying victims of DNA results of deceased suspects. And so, Mary, do you want to chime in? It looks like you maybe just recently had an involvement that mirrored this.
Yeah, we had a situation early on where law enforcement had been taking cases where the suspect was deceased and just putting those cases aside and or sometimes even closing them out. And when that was brought to our attention, one case in particular, that the rape had occurred in the 80s, and they were ready to close it out. And Dave and I left that case on my desk for almost a year and a half until we located that survivor, because we wanted her to know that we didn't need anything from her, but we wanted to offer services to her. But more importantly, we wanted her to know that the person that had attacked her was gone and wasn't going to bother her or anyone else anymore. And she just couldn't believe that anyone was even thinking about her or her case or what she had gone through, or the fact that we literally just doggedly held on to it to make sure that she knew that that situation was done. And I would absolutely say that everyone here is supposed to be thinking no kit left behind, no case left behind, no victim left behind. And just because the perp is deceased doesn't mean that that case is closed. You have to follow through with that last step.
Yes, we also had a case where the victim committed suicide, and we talked to the victim's family, and they told us that the suicide was definitely related to the sexual assault. And when there was a guilty plea in this case because he had other victims, at least we're able to give the victim's family some closure to know that the person who perpetrated the crime against their loved one has been identified and has actually, going to serve a long time in jail. So it kind of goes both ways. If the perpetrator could be dead or the victim could be dead, at least this unit, we don't let it stop, because I think it's important to give closure to the victim survivor. If the victim survivor is no longer around, then the victim's family.
Great. Great, I appreciate that. Another question that's come up, and this one you guys can both readily answer. So thoughts on advocacy initiated response or having community-based advocate make the initial calls to notify a victim or survivor in regards to a reopened cold case. So how are you guys incorporating advocacy, and what are your thoughts on incorporating advocacy to maybe have them make the first contact?
I mean, I think it's case by case in Orleans. When the case originates, starts with our police department, they have advocates who are involved in the notification process. If the case starts here in the district attorney's office, usually it's because the survivor has reached out to us to ask about the status of a cold case. So really the notification process it's not a traditional sort of process. We heavily use our community advocates as the case proceeds through trial, but the initial notification, I think the FJC was involved in the AG case, and it was unsolved. And so actually, if you think about it, we tend to think of a case as it starts at arrest. For victims, it starts at assault. And so our community advocates are already involved with some of our survivors before they even come to our police and then come to the prosecutor's office. So I don't think it's a bad idea at all to have advocates involved in it.
Right. And then the folks from Akron, I know that we heard Sandra just brag on the relationship with advocates. And so do y'all want to talk through your thoughts on having, the advocates take that maybe lead position in doing the notification?
Well, we take them with us for our initial contact. We kind of tag team. And once we get to know the person and the advocate is there to help out where, they kind of know, they can see when things are starting to go bad with the survivor, and they know when to jump in and help us out during the interview.
And I would just like to add too, I love the approach that we have, because not only do survivors need that support from advocates, they also need that information from investigators. So I'm not going to know what happened to their case 15 years ago and why it didn't move forward. The investigators are going to be the ones who have that information and can explain that to the survivor. So I love that we take that tag team and that team approach, because they get the best of both worlds at the same time.
Fantastic. And there is just one last question, and I'm going to throw this question to Patrick and just try to wrap it up quickly. We are almost at the end of time, but does anyone provide resources like gas cards or meals when victims travel? And is the plan to do that after COVID is lifted? So Patrick, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we have, and actually in the next 2 weeks, we have a trial going forward with my victim in particular. She's coming from Seattle. So yeah, she'll be supported either through our funding, more likely through the prosecutor's funding, because they'll, arrange the transportation and such. But, we've already, Jasmine and I personally have already helped her out with our own funds. So yeah, we do that.
Fantastic. I just want to take one more opportunity to thank the panelists. I think this has been a really, really enlightening and robust conversation today. I think what we'd like to do as we throw the contact information up for myself, make sure that you all know the contact information for how to get in touch with SAKI TTA. And then as we put the contact information for the panelists up, just there's going to be some poll questions that pop up. And so we would love you to participate in the poll. This really helps us with making sure that our ongoing TTA efforts are in place. It shouldn't take you too long to complete, but really take the time to answer those questions and and put your thoughts in around, the webinar itself today and maybe the ongoing TTA efforts. And if there's anything that myself or any member of the SAKI TTA team can help you with in the future, don't hesitate to reach out. I really appreciate you all attending today, and thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending today, and thank you so much to our facilitator, Amy, and our panelists. We really appreciate your time and all of this valuable information and experiences that you have shared with us today. As Amy said, we would appreciate if you could participate in the poll questions. I see quite a few of you doing that, so thank you so much for your feedback. And again, we will archive this webinar within a few business days, and it will be posted on the SAKI TTA website under the webinar section. And again, we thank you so much for your attendance, and we hope everybody has a great day.